we can control things like safety or integrity or customer service or quality. We've got a good bit of control over those, if not complete control over some of those. So restating and re-identifying the knowns and then sticking to those. This is the Leadership Foundry podcast. I'm your host this week, Brandon Smith. And this week, we're going to talk about something that I am experiencing with so many organizations and businesses today, leading through uncertainty. So I've got some points and some thoughts around how we can do that. But to join us on this discussion, I've got my wonderful co-host and producer, Whitney Mendoza. Whitney, how are you?
Great, Brandon. Glad to be here today with you.
Glad to have you here too. So Whitney, we are moving into, believe it or not, the end of the year. And so while that is exciting, we've got the end of the year holidays, we're turning the chapter to a new year. There's a lot of uncertainty right now. Whether we talk about election uncertainty or we talk about what the economy is going to look like uncertainty, or just general uncertainty about even the role of AI, if we think about kind of macro changes. And folks are trying to manage through that. When you think about uncertainty, Whitney, what comes to mind for you?
I feel like we are on Space Mountain right now. It's going really fast. It's been a little while since I have been on that particular roller coaster, but I remember like flashes of light, and it was pretty dark, and sometimes you could see where you were going, sometimes you couldn't. The whole thing, it was that was way more fun, but there was just a lot of uncertainty right on that ride, and you just weren't sure what to expect around that next corner.
You know, it's a really good analogy, and I'll add a little spin to this. So for those that know me, I've gone to Disney quite a number of times when my kiddos were little. We would go regularly. I've been on Space Mountain more times than I can probably count. And the challenge for me and for a lot of my family, because we tend to be taller, if you reach your arms all the way up, you will hit something. So there's uncertainty around what's kind of around us and making sure that we don't fall into those traps. I think that's also part of the challenge, is kind of keeping our hands in and making sure, we don't get hit by something. I think There's uncertainty around that too. So you're right. Fast moving, can't always see everything. I mean, there's a lot around us. I had a conversation with a client recently, and they're going through some exciting changes for their company, but there's also uncertainty. How are employees going to react to that? How long is it going to take? What are some of those things that maybe we're not anticipating? So I think uncertainty is definitely riding co-pilot with most all of us these days.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
So here's what I thought we would do today.
Okay.
I've got a four-step plan on how to manage through uncertainty. So I want to offer it up to listeners today as a way to think about how they can lead their teams through uncertainty, and maybe even in some cases lead themselves through uncertainty. All right, Whitney, are you ready?
I have my pen and paper to write this down.
Beautiful.
So ready.
So those of you who are listening, if you're not driving and listening or walking and listening, you should get your pen and paper ready. I think you'll find these 4 steps pretty practical, pretty easy, but also really helpful. So here's our first step. Step 1, what is the uncertainty? Try and define it. What are you uncertain about? Where's that anxiety coming from? So I gave some examples before, but perhaps you're uncertain, at least from a business or workplace standpoint, uncertain about the economy. What's the economy going to look like next year? For some of the clients that we work with Leadership Foundry, their business is very much tied to consumer spending. So if consumers are feeling good and confident, those companies are going to do well. If they're not feeling good and confident, it's going to be another tough year. So what is it that you're uncertain about? So maybe it's your customers. Maybe it's about competition. Maybe it's about new technology or innovations in your space that may be impacting your world. Or it could be more broadly, perhaps the election, or just perhaps general sentiment with your team. So what is the uncertainty? So the first step is we've got to name it. We've got to be able to identify what are the unknowns that we are not certain about that we're trying to manage for. Just naming it will help. So I don't mean to use this as kind of a morbid example, but this is in many ways also a classic example. Think about those people maybe in your life, or perhaps this is even you, that had some kind of illness, but you weren't certain with what it was, and it was just driving you crazy. And you kept going to doctors' offices and specialists, and they kept saying, well, we're really not sure. We run some tests, but we really don't know. That uncertainty itself creates such anxiety. But now imagine that time when that person that you knew, again, maybe it was you, that went in and finally got a diagnosis. Maybe it wasn't the diagnosis you wanted, but at least you knew. And that knowing then allowed us to make a plan. So the first step around managing through uncertainty is we have to name what are the variables or factors that are causing that anxiety for us. What are the areas of uncertainty? Name them and label them. That's step one. Whitney, any thoughts to that?
No, I loved that analogy because you're so right. Once you have the thing that you know is the problem, then you can work on getting to a solution.
Yeah.
And that in itself just lowers that anxiety level a little
Yeah.
bit. We can move towards something.
Exactly. So, okay. So now we're going to go on to step two. So step one is we've named that uncertainty. We know what it is. Maybe it's, the economy. Well, we'll call the economy for our purposes here today. Uncertain around where that's going to go. Okay. So step two is what we would call scenario planning. Right? So many of you are familiar with strategic planning. There's another school of thought that while strategic planning is good, strategic planning is predicated on more knowns than unknowns, right? Because we're going to plan out 3 years. So if you're going to plan out 3 years, you kind of have to have a sense of what's likely within your control or you can predict in order to be able to then strategize. If it's completely unknown, you can't really do strategic planning. And so that's when scenario planning comes in. Scenario planning is very much as it sounds. We're going to lay out some scenarios. So if this, then this. If the economy does great, then we'll do this. If the economy lags for the first quarter, then we'll do this. If the economy lags for the first and second quarter, then we'll do this. So it's essentially kind of laying out some possible scenarios. So I gave the example of the economy, but naturally we could do that with anything. How people are going to react to change in our organization. We could also lay that out. If people adopt change right away, then we're going to do this. If there's resistance, then we need to go to plan B, and that's going to look like this. So take those, or either that one item or those items that you laid out that were uncertain, that you're concerned about, and do a little bit of scenario planning around them. Now, this would be a great team effort to do as well. So if you've got a team that you're leading, have you sit down with your team, plan some time and say, hey, team, I know we're all anxious. There's some uncertainty going into 2025. Let's go ahead and talk about what are some different likely probabilities or scenarios which could happen, and what will we do if we see those events start to take place. So it gives you a little bit of, instead of kind of one game plan, it gives you multiple game plans based on how those uncertain variables turn to the left or to the right. So if we use one more analogy, think about the recent hurricanes that have hit Florida. It's so funny. We have gotten very good at being able to predict the formation of hurricanes. We can even predict kind of the intensity of hurricanes fairly well. We're not necessarily fantastic always at predicting the path of hurricanes, right? So in many ways, that's scenario planning. So you get one that's going to go up kind of the kind of western coast side of Florida in the Gulf, and then we might say, if it turns right into Tampa, then we need to do this. If it turns left and heads towards New Orleans, then we need to do this. So we can do a little bit of scenario planning as another example of kind of what happens when that hurricane or whatever that event is makes some lefts or some rights. So scenario planning is our second step.
That's fantastic, and I love that. Even if you say you have a 5-point plan and you get to point 2 and something changes, at least you had somewhere to start from again, right? Like even if you need to make a pivot, are we allowed to use that word still, pivot?
I think we can use pivot. Yeah.
Okay. It's been used so much over the past couple of years, but that's where we are. And again, at least you got a little bit of guidance there. You may have to change it in the middle, but you did have a starting place. So that's great advice.
Yeah. So okay. So we've We've named our step one was we named our uncertainties. We named those unknowns, right? Step two was we create scenario planning. What do we do if it goes right or goes left, right? What happens? Even around timing, like turns around in Q1 or Q2 or Q3. We've got some ways to handle uncertainty. So the step three is going to be a little different angle. We're going to talk about, what are you certain about? What are knowns that you want to rely on going into 2025? So what commonly used knowns are that are actually underutilized today are things like our company culture. So maybe there's some values that you just rest yourself on. It's just how you all decide to do work. Maybe integrity is one of those, or customer service is one of those, or quality is one of those, or safety is one of those. You've got a set of values. Double down on those, because that also helps to reduce some of the anxiety with not only you, but your team, when we're really focusing on, well, what are the things within our control? And how can we really live those out? We can control things like safety or integrity or customer service or quality. We've got a good bit of control over those, if not complete control over some of those. So kind of restating and re-identifying the knowns and then sticking to those. So I mentioned culture. Culture is one. Kind of goals or priorities would be two. Okay, so what are the goals for the year, and even kind of key priorities or initiatives we want to make sure we get done in 2025? Kind of name those. That's kind of our second one. And a third one just might be, generally speaking, what are the things, and you can ask your team this question, what are some other things that we want to feel good about at the end of 2025? So another way to do this is project out to 2025 and say, what are the things that we hope don't change in 2025 that we can control? So naturally, culture is one, strategy, goals, and priorities are another. Strategy loosely, but there could be others. There could be others in there that we say, well, we love the way that we treat our team members. We don't want to lose that. All right. Well, what would that look like in times of uncertainty? So spelling out the knowns and really committing to those is also important, because one of the ways that we can reduce anxiety is create more structure, more consistency. So anxiety is all about the unknown. So if we kind of double down on the knowns, it can also help us and our teams feel more confident going into uncertain environments. Some great examples would be, like, if you think about the United States military, for example. In most cases, every environment they're going into, if they're doing kind of an active activity in kind of other environment or other country that might be somewhat hostile, that's an unknown. We don't know how that's going to go. So they do kind of a before action review on how we think it's going to go, and then an after action review to reflect on that. But they also stick to all their principles and values. So the U.S. Army's, one of their big principles is bias for action. We're going to move forward. We're going to stop and reflect, but we're going to keep things moving. So they stick to their principles and their values. Marine Corps, even more so. So they're using that culture as a stabilizer as they're moving into environments that are very unstable and uncertain, to create more alignment, and also to give those individuals who are thrust in those situations some sense of continuity, some sense of stability. So our third step is we are going to identify and double down on the knowns.
I love that. In a way, it's almost like getting back to basics, right?
Yeah, great way to say it, Whitney.
It
Maybe
can
I
feel
shouldn't
like
have said that. Maybe I could have saved the last 5 minutes and just said, get back to basics.
No, I love the way you presented it, though, because you have to know what those basics are. You do have to remind yourself, your team, those that you work with, what are those basics that we need to turn back to? I mean, sometimes it can feel like, when we're in that state of anxiety, like, what more can we do to fix this? No, sometimes it's just, okay, what can we dial back, then go back to the core of how we operate and move forward from there. So I love the way you set it up.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we've had so far 3 steps. We talked about what are the unknowns, really naming those. Then we talked about doing scenario planning around those. So what happens if the hurricane goes right or left? Okay. And then we talked about what are the knowns, and we talked about things like culture and goals and priorities and how we want to operate with each other as ways we want to kind of really lean on that. And we use kind of the U.S. military as an example for that. So we've got a fourth one. Here's our fourth one. And the fourth one boils down to everyone listening right now. So what are the things within your control that you want to be highly focused on and consistent about, particularly if you're leading a team that's going through uncertainty? So the number one that I would say you really want to be consistent on with your team, if you really want to help them manage through uncertainty, it's going to sound simple. It might even sound a little silly, but it's extremely powerful. And if you mess it up, bad things are going to happen. Stick to your schedule of one-on-ones with your team members. So I'm going to say that again. Stick to your schedule of one-on-ones with your team members. So if you have a one-on-one with Sheila at 10 a.m. on Tuesdays, stick to that. Don't cancel those. What typically happens is when we go into states of urgency and uncertainty as leaders, the first thing we do is we cancel our one-on-ones because we just say, well, I'll catch up with Sheila next week. What that signals to Sheila is you are out of control. You have lost control. You're overwhelmed and you've got the helm of the ship. So Sheila's not real happy that the captain she's lost control. So you really want to make sure you stick to your one-on-ones. That consistency and stability, it shows that you're not rattled. You got this under control. You know, it's uncertainty, but it's not scary to you. And it really shows the team that you have them as a priority, supporting them and giving them what they need. So sticking to your one-on-ones is a great example of that. Generally speaking, sticking to a consistent routine is also really, really important for you in your week. So if you have certain meetings that happen on certain days, really try and stick to those. And then the third I would say is also making sure that as a leader, you are managing your kind of mental health and wellness. So you're not getting too stressed or overwhelmed. When you get stressed and overwhelmed, your team feels that. So the TED Talk I did back in 2016, I think it was on the contagiousness of emotions in the workplace. Now, if you haven't checked it out, you should. Go on YouTube. You can just type in contagiousness of emotions in the workplace, TED Talk. It'll come up. And it really focused on this growing body of research since the mid-1990s that, yes, emotions are contagious. Not all emotions are equally contagious. Anxiety is the most contagious. And if we're a leader, it's more like a factor of 2 or 3. So if we come in all anxious and overwhelmed, don't martyr and say, well, I'm carrying all this for my team so they can focus on their other stuff. No, your team is going to feel that. And they're going to feel very unsettled because their leader is also overwhelmed. So we really want to present a sense of kind of stability and calm in the storm. So making sure we're also taking care of ourselves. We're not overworking ourselves. We got good exercise routines, healthy routines. And while we care, we're not so overly emotionally invested that we're riding an emotional roller coaster, because our team, using the Space Mountain example, Whitney, doesn't want to be on that emotional roller coaster with us either. So having a little bit of sense of that, what I can control and what's in my control is really, really important, and dedicating time to that. That would be step number 4.
Yeah. I'd love for you to highlight too, Brandon, because the general theme of this feels like talk about it. Even if we don't have the right answer, even if we don't know all the pieces and parts, talk about it. At least you're naming it. You're coming up with a plan. You're still having one-on-ones. You're naming what's in your control. How can leaders approach this when they don't have all the answers?
Great example. Okay. This book is going to sound, it's really old school at this point. It's like one of those classics. And it's Good to Great. So if you haven't read the book Good to Great, it should probably be in your business bookcase somewhere. And in there, if I remember correctly, there's a chapter called Level 5 Leadership. And they talk about Admiral Stockdale and the Stockdale Principle. And in that chapter, what he was known for is he just, in kind of blunt honesty, named the situation. He didn't sugarcoat it. But he also didn't, overly dramatize it. He just bluntly said, here's the situation, folks. And talking about that and just naming it is really, really helpful and healthy. If we act like we have all the answers, our team knows we don't. That's not going to work very well. If we act like things aren't as serious as they are, our team's also going to know that. They're not going to trust us. So I'll give you two examples. I'll go back in time, and then I'll give you one more recent one. Back in 2007, 2008, I happened to be working with a home builder client. And this particular client was a very large kind of client in the southeastern region of the United States. And it was named after the founder of the business. And he happened to be in one of the rooms I was in. I was facilitating the session, and people were really freaking out because if you remember much about the 2006, 2007, 2008 recession in our economy as well as globally, a big piece of that was the real estate bubble burst. And so we had real issues with houses being able to be built and finished, people being able to buy houses because we had so many issues around how that had been done so poorly. There was a lot of cleanup banks had to do. So everyone in the room, you could feel the anxiety. It was palpable. There was a lot of uncertainty. He walked in and he said, he kind of almost jovially, he said, "Team, this is going to be a bumpy ride. And I want to be really clear, not for like the next year, like the next 3 years. It's going to take at least 3 years to clean this up. But it'll get cleaned up. We'll be fine. We've been through this before." So the news he delivered was actually bad news. The team wanted to hear him come back and say, "Hey, we do all these things. We're going to turn this around the next year." He came back and said, "There's not much we can do. It's 3 years at least. We're going to have to wait this out." So the news itself wasn't good, but the reaction of the room, you could feel the anxiety levels drop. It was like it created that sense of certainty. So that's a great example of just talking about it, just acknowledging it. Don't try and sugarcoat it. A more classic, more recent example, pandemic. The leaders that managed through the pandemic the best were the ones that said, "Folks, I have no idea. I don't know when we should be coming back into the office. I don't know if we should be requiring masks for people. I don't know what we should be doing. But together, we're going to kind of navigate through this. We're going to fail fast, and we're going to learn along the way." And those leading with that level of kind of honesty, authenticity, and vulnerability. And if you remember much about my trust formula, authenticity and vulnerability is one side of the equation. The other side's credibility. But authenticity and vulnerability, leading with that in those times of uncertainty, huge for developing and building trust and having folks kind of follow you. So I would kind of offer up those examples, Whitney, of just talking about it and kind of naming it.
I think that's fantastic. This has been so good. I totally took a full page of notes. Very helpful in a time that we need it.
Yeah. And I would say it comes back to each and every one of us as managers and leaders. Yeah. We've got anxiety. It's okay. Name that. Talk to your team about it. Yeah, team, this is what we're worried about. Let's talk about it a little bit more. Let's see how we can fail fast and navigate through that, whether we use scenario planning or we really double down on the stuff we do have control over to create more stability. The last thing that I would add, I would encourage everyone to kind of go through that 4-step plan and then don't stop there. Do some periodic check-ins. And the great way to do periodic check-ins around this, I would do them probably depending upon the level of uncertainty you're feeling, I would say either monthly or at minimum or quarterly. So kind of monthly to quarterly, somewhere in that range, and simply just check in and use the stop, start, continue prompt.
Yep.
Team, what can I or we start doing as we're navigating through this that maybe we're not? Anything I should stop doing or we should stop doing? Or anything we could continue doing that's working for you as we're kind of moving through this. That can be a great way to just course correct and make those adjustments.
Absolutely. Some of this we're all learning together, Brandon.
Amen, Whitney. Amen. Well, I hope for all of you listening, you found value in this conversation. You got something out of this that might be helpful to you to bring back to your team or just add to your toolkit. And as we always like to say on the Leadership Foundry podcast, what's that one thing you could start doing today that's going to help you and your team thrive tomorrow? Hey there, I'm Brandon Smith. I'm one of the founders of the Leadership Foundry, and I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about what we do. If you're not familiar with the Leadership Foundry, we are a cutting-edge leadership development firm. We work with leaders across all different levels, across all different sectors, with the goal of helping you and them elevate your leadership to some of the most cutting-edge best practices today, whether they're based on the themes of some of our books or some of the learnings we get from leaders
out in the world, we are always trying to find some of the most practical things you can put in place to make your leadership that much more effective. What makes our approach so unique and innovative is our engagements are typically 6 months, with 2-hour sessions spread across those 6 months, typically 1 session per month, allowing leaders the opportunity to apply those learnings over that month. In addition, we pair every one of our leaders with a coach during their engagement. And that coach helps them not only implement those new things, but also helps them navigate some of the challenges they have. In addition to being cutting edge and innovative, we're also very affordable. Because we do so much of our work virtually, we can offer you a price point for this kind of leadership development that is probably lower than you've ever experienced. So if you're interested in learning more, please reach out to me. We are fielding our client list for 2025 right now and would love to talk to you a little bit further. You can reach out to me directly on LinkedIn or any of my social media platforms, as well as my email, bsmith@myleadershipfoundry.com.